From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump sidesteps pressure to agree on security guarantees for Ukraine during a visit by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the two just wrapping a joint news conference.
The U.S. and U.K. have a special relationship.
This has been a very good and very productive visit.
We'll have a live report from the White House straight ahead with insights from Ben Hodges, former commanding general, U.S. Army Europe.
And we'll talk with trade expert Andrew Hale at the Heritage Foundation as President Trump reiterates plans to implement tariffs against Canada and Mexico next week.
Congresswoman Haley Stevens will also weigh in on the impact of tariffs from her home state of Michigan and whether Congress will manage to avoid a government shutdown. Thanks for being with us. On the late edition of Balance of Power, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. President Trump and British Prime Minister Starmer during their meeting today discussing a wide range of topics, including the war in Ukraine and, of course, tariffs, as we heard a short time ago. Listen.
The United Kingdom is a wonderful country that I know very well.
Our countries have been bound together for a very long time now. The closest alliance, I think, of any two countries when it comes to prosperity and security. And our trade, obviously, is fair and balanced, and in fact, you've got a bit of a surplus, so we're in a different position there. And obviously, we've contributed hugely in relation to Ukraine, and taken together with Europe, there's about 50%.
It'll work out.
Does that mean there won't be any sanctions on the UK then?
We'll have to take a look. You know, the British have been incredible soldiers, incredible military. And they can take care of themselves. But if they need help, I'll always be with the British, okay? I'll always be with them. If you want peace, you have to talk, both sides. As I discussed with Prime Minister Starmer, the next step we're making is toward a very achievable ceasefire.
It can't be peace that rewards the aggressor or that gives encouragement to regimes like Iran. We agree history must be on the side of the peacemaker, not the invader.
I think we'll have two deals. I think we'll have a deal on ending the war, and I think we're going to end up with a great trade deal with you.
Let's turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is at the White House this evening with more from today's meeting. So obviously, Tyler, a lot of ground covered, and much of it setting the stage for the meeting that will take place tomorrow between Ukrainian President Zelenskiy and President Trump.
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. Well, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying that the stakes could not be higher and that Europe was ready to up its responsibility when it came to securing Ukraine's future. He said that the UK would start to boost its own security assistance to the country as well as its defense spending as part of its GDP, something that President Trump has asked NATO allies to do as well. But the big question here is whether or not that is enough to get security guarantees from this White House. Of course, Keir Starmer's visit comes just days after the French president was also here making a similar case. French President Emmanuel Macron putting forward a framework from the UK and France that they would like to see European peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine, but that they would like to have the U.S. underwrite such an effort. President Trump sidestepped questions about it today, saying that he does not want to talk about those guarantees until a firmer deal is in place. But we have heard this White House repeatedly say that those guarantees could end up being implicit if the White House signs this economic cooperation deal with Ukraine, because then the U.S. would have a vested economic interest in the country. It's something that no doubt will be a point of topic tomorrow when Ukrainian President Zelenskiy is here, considering we know he would like to see firmer, tangible security commitments from the U.S. But Joe and Kaylee, when we are talking about economic ties, just quickly at the end of that presser there, President Trump making some news saying that the U.S. and the U.K. have restarted long-stalled trade negotiations. And in President Trump's words, that deal could be reached rather quickly.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Thank you so much, Tyler. We'll have more later in the hour on those economic talks getting underway at the White House here. But let's stick with Ukraine. Joining us now for insights on what we heard today, retired General Ben Hodges, former commanding general, U.S. Army Europe, now senior advisor to Human Rights First. Welcome back, General, to Balance of Power. It's great to see you. Donald Trump says he has spoken twice with Vladimir Putin. He's set tomorrow to sign a minerals deal with Ukraine. Do we have the ingredients here for peace?
I think it's really hard to say. The fact that the president cannot bring himself to acknowledge that Putin is responsible for this war, that the Russians invaded, that the war could end tomorrow if the Russians would pull out of Ukraine. That's not going to happen, and the Russians are not going to do that if the United States does not insist on it. Having said that, I think we're at the beginning of a very long process that I hope will end with a resolution of this conflict, with the Ukrainian sovereignty being protected, restored, and it has to be done in a way that Russia is not rewarded for what it has done. So sort of three phases: preparation phase, which we're in now, then a ceasefire phase, including deployment of troops to ensure the ceasefire, because nobody expects Russia to live up to the agreement otherwise. And then the third phase would be actual negotiations. So I think we're in this phase now where all different conversations are underway.
Well, General, you say nobody expects Russia to live up to the agreement otherwise, and yet it did seem, at least the indication was from President Trump, that he does believe Russia will. He says he's known Putin a long time. He doesn't think he will go back on his word, which is why he views U.S. backing of UK and France peacekeeping troops as unnecessary. What is your view on it?
Well, certainly if the president of the United States says he trusts the president of the Russian Federation, he must have some additional information, or he has made it clear to President Putin, that if the Russians don't live up to it, then they will pay a huge price. And to be fair, the president does have enormous leverage over the Russians now that we did not have before. Russia's in trouble. I mean, they are not winning this war. There's no way they can knock Ukraine out unless we quit. So the president has a lot of economic tools he could use, or he could open up the floodgates on weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. So perhaps that's what he has in mind. I'm just saying that there is zero evidence that Russia has ever lived up to any agreement unless they were forced to comply. And so that's why I think people are skeptical and a little concerned that the president criticizes everybody, but you never hear him criticize Vladimir Putin, who's the guy responsible for this war.
Well, so talk to us more about this idea of security guarantees. You know a lot about force protection and certainly Article 5, and I'm not trying to draw that comparison to a country that's not part of NATO here, but Keir Starmer, other European leaders want security guarantees. So does President Zelenskiy. Donald Trump said today the backstop will be Americans working in Ukraine to implement this minerals deal. Does that count as a guarantee?
Well, this will be something for President Zelenskiy and our European allies to have to consider. I've listened to the president now, both after the Macron visit and then today's visit by Prime Minister Starmer. I'm anxious to hear what he says tomorrow. And it is implicit, exactly as your reporter said earlier, that if the assumption would be that if the United States is going to have business inside Ukraine developing these mining interests, then presumably that means the Russians would not dare to attack any allies that were deployed there to ensure compliance with the ceasefire. But I don't know if that's good enough for allies who are planning to put their soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, by the way, the Russians have said no way can any NATO or European troops be part of any sort of peacekeeping force. So we have a long way to go. I know the president likes to talk about we're going to get this done, and I personally hope it does get done to a satisfactory result that everybody can live with. But I just am skeptical it's going to happen that fast, because it will take a while. I mean, we think about the force that has to go in there to ensure compliance with a ceasefire. It has to be air, land, sea, drone, counter-drone. It has to have rules of engagement that allow them to punish the Russians if they violate the ceasefire. We're months away from having a force that's ready to do that.
Well, General, I'd like to keep the focus on timetables here, because we're hearing a big game talked by European leaders, including UK Prime Minister Starmer today, about increasing defense spending. But we're talking about the UK targeting 3% of GDP by 2035. It's going to take it and other countries a while to actually ramp up their own defense capacities. Is it going to take longer than potentially the downdraw of U.S. support in these very same countries? Do they have the time, the capacity to do this quickly?
Well, you have to think about the threat. What is the threat, Kaylee? And so the Russians, I imagine, are anticipating that Europe will begin to reach much higher levels of defense readiness and capabilities over the coming next 3, 4, 5 years. The Germans have talked about being ready by 2029 to have a much higher level of readiness of their armed forces. So if you're in the Kremlin and you see that perhaps the United States is not totally committed to defense in Europe, if Ukraine fails, then you could say, well, then the Russians will want to do whatever it is they're going to do before 2029. If you accept that as a threat horizon. But, to increase the amount of spending that we're talking about, I mean, not even the United States could increase by such a large amount in such a short amount of time. So UK has been a 2% country for a long time. A huge chunk of that 2%, by the way, goes to pay for their nuclear force. So even where they are, the land forces in particular of the UK are quite small, and they're stretched just like most of our allies are, and frankly, like we are.
General, we only have about a minute left. Just quickly, I wonder your thoughts on reports that Ukraine is stepping up the use of F-16 fighter jets, not just intercepting Russian cruise missiles and drones, but in fact now targeting Russian forces along the border here with Ukraine. To what extent can Ukraine use tools like the F-16 to strengthen its hand before it's at the peace table?
Well, this is exactly what they should be doing. They're trying to protect their own population, to protect soldiers, and using weapons like F-16 as part of an overall effort to block Russian efforts. Because the Russians, of course, also want to improve their position going into any sort of negotiations.
All right, General, thank you so much for joining us. Retired General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the U.S. Army Europe and senior advisor to Human Rights First. We appreciate it. And still ahead, the S&P 500 erasing its gains for the year today in a stock sell-off driven by NVIDIA's results and renewed tariff threats from President Trump, who says 25% levies on Canada and Mexico are on track to go into effect on Tuesday. We'll speak with Democratic Congresswoman Hale Stevens of Michigan about the potential impact of these tariffs on her district, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I said, why are we letting you make millions of cars and send them in? He was unable to answer the question. Justin Trudeau, nice guy. I think he's a very good guy. The fact is that if we don't give them cars, we don't have to give them cars. The tariffs will make it impossible for them to sell cars into the United States.
That was President Trump yesterday on pending tariffs facing auto imports. And today on Truth Social, he confirmed tariffs on Mexico and Canada, where a lot of this auto trade happens with the U.S., are still scheduled to take effect on March 4th, 25%. So it could impact domestic production of vehicles in addition to the auto tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs, you name it. And we want to get into all of this now with Democratic Congresswoman Hale Stevens of Michigan, of course, representing a district that could feel the impact of this. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. The president argues that these tariffs are designed to protect the American auto industry, and yet we've heard from industry executives like Jim Farley at Ford that this could blow a hole in the industry. What are you hearing from your constituents?
Yeah, well, and let's be honest, there's a difference between tariffs on Canada and Mexico and the parts, components, the goods that come in from those countries than there is on tariffs on steel and aluminum, which we as a country have really been struggling with dumping and some arguably questionable activity from the Chinese Communist Party. So what we're talking about are Canada tariffs, and it's really concerning that the president just keeps going back and forth on this. and seems very intent to exact some sort of maximum pressure on one of our best trade partners. Particularly, I'm in Southeast Michigan. I'm going to tell you, we have over $1 billion of exports just from my humble congressional district of about 800,000 people. We've got about $1 billion of exports into Canada. So why would we be tariffing goods coming from Canada, particularly at the level that the president is talking about? We've got such an integrated supply chain. We've got a company like Magna that we're so proud of, that has headquarters in Troy, Michigan, and is a Canadian company and doing so much for our auto industry. And I just hate to see these guys get a self-inflicted whack when really we need to be innovating, we need to be producing, we need to be making and then selling Michigan-made automobiles all over the world and pushing back on the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, you talk about an integrated supply chain, Congresswoman. An integrated manufacturing process is a big part of this as well. As we've all learned in the last couple of weeks, that car components frequently in a state like yours will cross the border 7 or 8 times before they actually end up in a finished vehicle. As you understand it, are you having conversations with the White House, with the Treasury about this? Will that mean compounded tariffs every time a component crosses the border? Or will there be a carve-out for automakers? Because I suspect that they'd start changing their manufacturing plans pretty quickly.
Yeah, and look, manufacturing is complex. It's capital intensive, as many of your viewers know, and you can't just snap your fingers and turn the light switch on and off, particularly with multi-million-dollar facilities. So this idea that we'd somehow tariff Canada and see some sort of reshoring here into Michigan is a false notion, and it is not necessarily the desired outcome. We have a bolstered, strengthened supply chain here in Michigan, and we've got a great trade partner with Canada. And I'm going to tell you, Joe, to your question, I invite and welcome anyone to my congressional district, my county executive, the great Dave Coulter, and I, the Oakland County executive. We would gladly welcome an official to walk a manufacturing shop floor. I regularly go and visit manufacturers. I even have a program called Manufacturing Monday. And I'll tell you, I was just visiting Detroit Axle, an amazing company located in Ferndale, Michigan, $400 million in sales. And the thought of Canada tariffs is just choking them. And he said, look, I know it's not a tariff on Detroit Axle, but it's still a disruption to our industry. And so we invite and welcome walking a day in the shoes of Michigan manufacturers, our incredible workers. Well, and let's get the best outcome for everybody here.
I've got to tell you, Congresswoman, we only have 2 or 3 minutes left, so we want to use our time as effectively as possible without doing a full lightning round, although I bet you'd probably take part in that. I want to ask you, with regard to everything we're talking about here, aren't you going to have a story to tell if you decide to run for Senate? Because the big talk in Washington, there's been a lot of reporting on this, is that you may well run to replace the retiring Gary Peters in your state of Michigan. I don't know if you want to tell our listeners and viewers something important today, but when do you plan to make that decision?
Well, Gary Peters is certainly an iconic and incredible lawmaker. It's someone who began their career in federal government in the United States House of Representatives and then moved to the Senate. He's been a champion for manufacturing, our automotive workers, STEM education, and so many issues that I, as a member of Congress, who actually gets to boast Gary Peters as a constituent, it's pretty cool. He doesn't live too far from me, actually. But I've enjoyed collaborating and being his partner, and I really want to recognize his leadership and salute him. In terms of any forthcoming announcement or decision, Joe, that's going to be after we pass that federal budget, you know, after we appropriate and fund our government. So stay tuned for something along those lines.
Well, we're listening very closely. You'll have to come back and tell us here on Bloomberg when you make up your mind. Democratic Congresswoman Hale Stevens of Michigan. We always appreciate the insights here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, Andy Jassy, CEO of Amazon, speaking with Bloomberg earlier today about how the Trump administration is working with big tech. That conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. This morning, Andy Jassy, the CEO of Amazon, sat down with our colleague Caroline Hyde, where they discussed the Trump administration's policies regarding big tech. She started by asking Jassy about the impact of Chinese companies having to pay more to get their goods into the U.S.
On de minimis specifically, we have a certain number of items that are shipped in that way as well for things like Hale, which is our new low price offering. We maybe have less of it than some other companies like the ones that you mentioned. But I think it's early in this administration. But what I would say is that it is encouraging to us that we have an administration that wants to hear from business. I would say that we've been a business through 6 administrations. Every single one of them, our primary focus is to take care of customers, but we try to build a productive relationship with the administration because we want to help the country. And I would say that some administrations are more receptive to it than others, but this administration cares about what business thinks. And I've always been surprised that it isn't obvious that the best economic results for a country are going to be when the public and the private sector collaborate. And, I don't expect the government to kowtow to what companies want, but they should get their feedback and their input because they're going to make policies better together if they collaborate. And I'm encouraged early on that this administration wants to talk to businesses.
Are you taking calls personally?
I take calls. We talked, same thing with all the administrations. We talk to people in the administration. We share what's working for us, what's not working for us, concerns that we have. As I said, some administrations care more about our feedback than others.
Has Trump cared about yours? Have you spoken to the president?
I have spoken to the president. Look, as I said, this administration has been pretty busy the first month. But I am encouraged that they are having conversations with businesses and they do care about our feedback. And we'll see what happens, but it starts with a dialogue. You have to have a dialogue to have any kind of relationship.
You can find our full conversation with Andy Jassy, CEO of Amazon, online and on the terminal. Kaylee, he said today they're going to be rolling out a new smarter Alexa in the fall. Maybe she can take our jobs.
Yeah, maybe Alexa's listening to us right now. We probably just started it in someone's home. Who's
I always kind of enjoy doing that.
TV
hey, Alexa.
Listening on radio.
Teach you to keep that plugged in. Coming up, President Trump says the Mexico, Canada, and China tariffs are still on track to be implemented all on the same day next week. We'll speak ahead with Andrew Hale, the Heritage Foundation, about what to expect next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going to have a great trade agreement. One way or the other, we're going to end up with a very good trade agreement for both countries. And we're working on that as we speak. I think we'll have the confines. I think we'll have something maybe even in terms of possibilities agreed to very shortly.
Our trading relationship is not just strong, it's fair, balanced and reciprocal.
President Trump, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, in a joint news conference earlier today discussing efforts to reach a new U.S.-UK trade agreement. The president said a deal will be finalized soon, and that is where we start our conversation with Andrew Hale, Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Andrew, thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got a lot of questions for you about a lot of different issues that are tied to this, but is a trade deal with the U.S. the UK's best chance at avoiding tariffs?
Well, it's certainly the position of the Heritage Foundation that we have a UK-US free trade agreement. And of course, I published an op-ed on the Hill a few months ago calling for that. Having said that, some of the reaction I had from members of Congress, senators who were in that building in the Capitol just over there behind my office, and their staff, when I speak to them about a potential UK-US free trade agreement, I get a lot of questions about free speech in the United Kingdom. And trade policy is not just about trade policy. It's about national security, as you've seen with the border. It's also about shared values. So, again, in the United Kingdom under Prime Minister Keir Starmer has become a dystopian censorship state. And of course, J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, raised this issue and called Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the Oval Office today out at the White House when they had their big press conference and meeting. He called the United Kingdom out for the censorship state that is in the United Kingdom. And he also raised this in his very good speech at the Munich Security Conference. There was also last year a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing where they raised the case of the UK online harms bill. And if the United Kingdom is going to be arresting people for Facebook posts, and putting grandparents in prison over Facebook posts and letting hardened criminals out, as Elon Musk has referred to Prime Minister Keir Starmer as two-tier Keir, I think that will be a huge barrier to a potential UK-US free trade agreement. Because we want to have, if you're going to have free trade in the United States, you also have to have free speech as well.
So I guess, Andrew, it begs the question of what exactly tariffs are being used as a tool to accomplish. Is it to try to extract behavioral changes from those you're negotiating with, as you're alluding to here with speech issues in the UK? Is it about actually trying to get more reciprocal trade between countries, or is it a means to raise revenue? Because we've heard a little bit about all of that from President Trump. What is the Heritage's view on the proper use of levies?
Well, I think they're doing it for all of those reasons you mentioned. And President Trump is using tariffs as an instrument of statecraft to achieve matters often that go well beyond trade policy, as we've seen with, of course, his proposed tariffs against Canada and Mexico, the 25% under IEEPA. That's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. In his first term, President Trump discovered he had exclusive control over 301, 201, and 232 tariffs. And he's willing to use this, as he did in his first term, to employ them as an instrument of economic coercion in matters that go well beyond trade policy often. So as we've seen, of course, there's a crisis at the southern border with Mexico with the fentanyl crisis and the migration crisis, and he's declared appropriately an emergency. Whether or not he can actually use IEEPA for that, because, of course, it's not mentioned in the legislation, the word tariff. It's never been used to impose tariffs before. I think a lot of these things will be, and of course, Congress gave that power to the president in 1977 and didn't intend him to use it as a means to impose tariffs. Perhaps a federal judge might, strike that down. Who knows? I think a lot of these things will eventually be decided in the federal courts.
Yeah, well, that sure seems to be the case. And if we focus on tariffs as a tool of statecraft, as you mentioned, and they're used properly, the U.S. receives concessions from all of the nations we're talking about, zeroes out trade balances. The goal is essentially no tariffs then, right? We wouldn't have any left.
Well, I think with regards to Canada and Mexico, they have, we haven't seen the tariffs implemented. Yes, he did say that we could expect them next Tuesday. But again, they keep conceding to President Trump's demands. They have provided more border security. They have, Trudeau's, I think, promised $1.3 billion over several years. Claudia Sheinbaum has promised thousands of national service guardmen to the Mexican border. But also, they do keep conceding to his demands. But also, I've been speaking to people close to the current negotiations between the United States and Canada. And apparently, the goal now is to get Canada to agree to the Keystone XL pipeline, which, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau put the kibosh on, as well as President Biden. And, of course, the ESG policies are going out the window, and we need to get that Keystone pipeline. So I think if they start doing those things, we'll probably see the tariff threat recede.
All right, but if we don't, there is, of course, a question of what would follow economically, both in Canada but also here in the United States. And Andrew, the president was asked a question about this at his joint press conference with Prime Minister Starmer today about who exactly ultimately pays for tariffs and whether or not they're inflationary. This is what he said.
It's a myth that's put out there by foreign countries that really don't like paying tariffs, and especially to even up. So we've been treated badly by a lot. We're using tariffs. And I find, and you just have to look at the numbers, but I find that it's not about inflation. It's about fairness. And the inflation for us has not existed. And I don't think it's going to exist.
But I am looking at some numbers here, Andrew, specifically on a poll that Bloomberg has conducted with the Harris poll that finds 60% of U.S. adults expect that the tariffs from the president will lead to higher prices. What do you say to those people?
Well, if you look at the specific example of the proposed steel tariffs against, for example, Canada, we get 40% of our steel from Canada. Now, that's a 232 tariff on national security grounds. Well, the reason we get so much of our steel from Canada, 40%, is because we have very, very harsh EPA environmental regulations. Indeed, there were new ones that were put out by the Biden-Harris administration last year. And net zero targets and steel production do not mix. So, for example, Canada can produce their steel with their hydroelectric power, which is deemed to be green energy. We don't have that luxury. They've been blessed with vast hydroelectric power. Also, in 1990, the United States had 57 blast furnaces to produce steel. We're now down to 11. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, one in Birmingham, Alabama, which I understand was built first in the 1800s. It got an upgrade in 1930 and then again in the 1950s. That door of that furnace blew open a couple weeks ago. Men in that facility were permanently disfigured by molten steel flying around the room. And we have to seriously upgrade our infrastructure. But the reason we don't, the reason we've lost these blast furnaces is because of these harsh environmental regulation. It's very difficult to get permitting to build a new blast furnace. And until we actually deal with the infrastructure problem and these horrific regulations, then we can't replicate that 40% of steel we're getting from Canada made with hydroelectric power overnight here in the United States. And therefore, we will, of course, pay more. With you looking at copper, we get, 16% from Canada, refined copper, and 69% from Chile. Again, we have horrific EPA regulations that prohibit us from exploiting our vast natural resources of copper. And that's why we're having it refined abroad. It's why we're sourcing it abroad. And so if we actually deal with these very crippling regulations that we have created here in the United States. We create these problems right here in Washington, and we can deal with them right here in Washington. I'm confident we can do so under the Trump administration, because, of course, as Trump said, drill, baby, drill. He wants to, free up the fossil fuel market here in the United States. And I think we deal with that. That would be the first priority. And so I'm actually in favor of dealing with the regulations first and then looking at the tariffs second.
All right, Andrew Hale, Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us. Coming up, House Republicans approved their own budget framework, but now have to come to an agreement with their Senate counterparts. It's probably not going to be easy. We'll talk about it with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Republicans are lying to the American people about Medicaid. There's nothing more that I would like better, that we as House Democrats would like better, than for Republicans to prove us wrong.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries earlier today on Capitol Hill talking about the budget resolution that passed with exclusively Republican support in the House earlier this week. And joining us now for more is this evening's political panel, Kevin Walling, Vice President of HG Creative and Democratic Strategist, alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Welcome to you both. Sarah, obviously what we just heard the leader alluding to there is this notion that what passed does prescribe $880 billion worth of cuts from the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House specifically. Many people say you can't do that without touching Medicaid. Even the Senate now seems to have concerns about that. So what's the actual conversation happening? Will Medicaid be touched?
It will not. So here's the plan.
How do you do it?
So first of all, the 4th congressional district that has the most Medicaid people in it happens to be the Speaker of the House.
Wow.
So he's like, we can't cut Medicaid. I mean, a lot of my constituents are getting it. As I said, it's number 4. So what the hope is to find it through fraud and cuts in that way. I mean, California spends $8 billion a year on Medicaid for illegals. That is where they're hoping to go and claw that back. But you will not see the Medicaid change for the population that's on it.
Well, that's a big deal if both the Speaker and President Trump say that. I suspect that's the case, Kevin. The question is, our favorite phrase around here lately, waste, fraud, and abuse. Is there enough money there?
Well, and of course, President Trump doubled down on that language, as he did in the campaign, that Social Security, Medicare, and now Medicaid won't be touched. That was something that he has since added on the campaign. Read my lips, right? With George H.W. Bush reference. listen, to Sarah's point, there's agreement, right? We can always tackle waste, fraud, and abuse in the system. But $880 billion is a huge amount of money. That's nearly $1 trillion. 86% of our funding for the government is Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and defense spending, right? So if you're going to put up that big of a number under energy and commerce, certainly there's going to be some cuts to services. 41 million children in this country rely on Medicaid as their direct health care. So I'm more interested to see, to the leader's point, in that clip that you played, what Republicans are going to put forward, because we need some concrete answers as to what actually they're going to cut.
Well, and here's the other thing. Even if you can find enough for the cuts that have been outlined as mandatory to allow the Ways and Means Committee just $4.5 trillion to extend the 2017 tax cuts, the Senate wants those things permanent. And if the House is going to have the leeway to do that, you have to find even more spending cuts. Sarah, how is this ultimately going to be reconciled?
So the Speaker yesterday briefed the members, the Republican Main Street Partnership, and said they're laying out a lot of waste and fraud. They're finding a lot of it. They're not ready to go public with it yet, but they brought in Senator Thune.
Enough to make the tax cuts permanent?
Very close. They're almost there. They're very pleased about that. There is a tremendous amount of waste and fraud in many aspects in this country. I mean, we have wonderful federal employees. We love them, but there's also some waste. Even in the Defense Department, they're taking a look at it. I mean, yes, we have to fund the men and women in the military and make sure they have the best equipment, but maybe we don't have to pay $1,000 for a toilet seat. Maybe we can pay $20. So they're taking a look at all of that. I'm really pleased with the briefing that we got last night. I really think the American people are going to be very happy after we get through some of these hiccups. Even the co-president, whatever you want to call it, Elon Musk, even he admitted he's made some mistakes in this, and he has, and they're backing that back and moving forward. So it's really going to be exciting.
He said.
Exactly.
Well, it's a little bit of everything.
So this is a really important conversation. It's a complicated one. We're going to be having it for a long time probably, but in only a couple of weeks, we need to fund the government here. And I'm a little worried about what your crystal ball is saying after the last time we spoke. Are we going to shut down? Because a lot of Democrats are saying we're not here to help.
Well, and you saw Richard Blumenthal, others, Senator from Connecticut, Democrat, say, Republicans have all levers of power. It's on them to pass the government funding. It's in no one's interest for the government to shut down. Sarah and I have been together with you through other government shutdowns and continuing resolutions.
This feels different, though, does it?
It feels different with the backdrop of these other negotiations that are going on. A new wrinkle, of course, is the conversation about making some of these cuts, to Sarah's point, with DOJ permanent now in these CRs, right? The funding that they're cutting back. Democrats are coming forward and saying, Rosa DeLauro, our appropriations ranking member, is saying, okay, if Congress allocates this money, the executive should spend this money, and we want that to be understood as part of these negotiations. It hasn't gotten up to the four leaders yet in terms of what the readouts are, but it seems like they are making progress because it is in no one's best interest for a government shutdown, Republicans or Democrats.
Might not be in anyone's interest, Sarah, but what odds do you put on it?
Okay, so last week I was a little bit skeptic. This week I'm 100%. It's not going to shut down.
Not going to shut down.
No, we are good.
And I think you predicted that in the past, and you've been right.
I have been.
Yeah.
There's a plan.
I think Sarah's undefeated.
Well, only because I'm sitting in the room. But there is a plan. And you saw in the budget, I mean, it was a very long night. Most of the members started going home, and then President Trump, who is the president, there's no co-president, who is the president, got on the phone and started calling. We call these people rhinos because they're not really Republicans to us. He started getting them. He moved all but one of them. So we're very confident that that's going to continue to happen. So, no, I am 100% no government shutdown.
Wow. Take it to the bank, huh?
I guess so.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, it's pretty remarkable. I would point out we just got some headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal on another issue, this one possibly related to tariffs, that Mexico and the U.S. are now working to counter illegal fentanyl and arms traffic across the border. This, Kevin, after the president said today they're not making enough progress on fentanyl for that reason. 25% tariffs on Tuesday, not just on Mexico, but on Canada. Once again, are we seeing leverage or tariffs being used as leverage rather? And is this another example of that possibly actually being quite effective?
I mean, it appears so. Hopefully that's the case. I watched with great interest the conversation you just had with Congresswoman Stevens, right? Mm-hmm. Just in her one district alone, the flow of goods back and forth to Canada would be so detrimental. You have a lot of these indices that we're talking about in terms of consumer indexes, inflation concerns on the rise. I think with that backdrop with this administration and some of the statistics you just shared in that Harris poll of concerns about what the tariffs cost will be passed on to the American people. Hopefully there is a recalculation that's going on, and it is part of this maximum pressure campaign, and we will step back from the abyss on those tariffs.
So a lot of folks think these are never going to be implemented. Mm-hmm. Do we think tariffs work if you never have to use them?
Yes, because what President Trump is doing is he's using them for negotiation to us. China, huge fentanyl crisis, as you just said. Yeah. He's trying to get them to control that. I mean, and as you're seeing the past couple of days, you've had two huge American companies say, okay, we're going to build facilities here. Yep. Apple, $500 billion, and Lilly, millions of dollars. So that's helpful. Like, he's bringing the jobs back home. So these tariffs, they're very much a negotiating to us. Maybe they're going to effect, but I think the art of the deal is definitely there. It's an interesting to watch this administration.
It sure is. You've got this revelation from Mexico. Andrew Hale suggesting Keystone XL pipeline might unlock. Yeah. We'll see what happens with Canada. With the help of our panel, Kevin Walling and Sarah Chamberlain, thank you so much, as always. Coming up, we'll look ahead to Ukrainian President Zelenskiy's visit. That's tomorrow. We'll have it next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
A dictator without elections. Zelenskiy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction.
Do you still think that Mr. Zelenskiy is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that.
Did he say that? President Trump walking back comments he did make just over a week ago where he referred to Ukrainian President Zelenskiy as a dictator. And this comes ahead of Zelenskiy's visit to the White House tomorrow, which is expected to bring a signing of a minerals deal amid the Trump administration's negotiations to end the war with Russia. And joining us now for more on what we can expect from the visit is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley. So, Dan, I guess it remains unclear if the president actually believes the person he's hosting tomorrow is a dictator, but do they actually believe the same thing in terms of what it is they're trying to accomplish tomorrow? Are they both on board with signing this thing?
As far as we know, at this moment, they are. I don't think Zelenskiy would be coming if Trump and he were not on the same page when it comes to signing this critical minerals deal. And of course, he was asked about Trump was asked about this in his press conference with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer earlier today. And what he said was basically, this is going to be a very important deal to keep the U.S. invested in Ukraine and to sort of send a signal to the Russians that the U.S. will be there. And this will come in the place of some other type of backstop, a military backstop, U.S. troops on the ground or something of that nature, which is really what the Europeans and the British want. But, from Trump's perspective, this is just as good. So we'll see what happens tomorrow.
You call him a dictator, that's one thing, but a modestly successful comedian, those are fighting words, which he used in the same post on Truth Social. I just wonder, what's the vibe going to be tomorrow, and how will Zelenskiy be treated? Does he get the bilateral treatment in the East Room? Is he going to be standing next to the desk in the Oval Office while the president's doing the Sharpie routine? What are the optics of this visit?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, Trump is, if nothing else, a showman. So I think that, all of the sort of harsh words that have been exchanged over the last couple of weeks will probably go away for the next 24 hours or so. And you will see a united front. Certainly, Trump has a lot of Ukraine supporters on his staff. We know that Vice President J.D. Vance has a perspective on this that is a little bit different. But you look at Michael Waltz as the national security advisor. You look at Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. You look at, the support that Ukraine has in Congress. So I think that this will be a show of unity. Now, what happens 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours after that remains to be seen, because there is still this question of will Trump and Putin meet? Where will they meet? Will it be in Saudi Arabia? Will there be more preconditions put on that meeting before they actually meet? Yeah. Or will Trump just sort of say, as he did with the phone call, hey, let's get together. Let's hash this out. So once this agreement is in place, if it is signed tomorrow, which we expect to happen, then this sort of unlocks a lot more to come.
Great. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley will be watching tomorrow with Dan's help. Thank you for the great reporting, and check out the Washington Edition newsletter ahead of tomorrow's visit. Find it on the terminal and online.
And find us back here with the full readout of the visit. We'll see you then on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.